Welcome to Shellphone, the podcast that gives the ocean its very own hotline. Join us as we hear from ocean stewards, discover threats to ocean health, and learn ways we can all answer the ocean's call. This podcast is brought to you by Breach the Surface and Coastal Creative. I'm Harmony Dawson, and joining us this episode is Dr. Erin Spencer. Before we get into the episode, can you quickly introduce yourself and your work?
Yes, hi. Thank you for having me. My name is Dr. Erin Spencer. I am a marine ecologist and science writer based in Miami, Florida, and I'm really excited to share a little bit about my work today.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for being here. You did your PhD at the Florida International University, and you studied the movement, diet, and thermal tolerance of hammerhead sharks. Can you kind of give us a little overview of how and why you studied these sharks and some things that we know about them?
Yeah, absolutely. So doing my PhD at FIU is actually what brought me down to Miami. If you were to ask me 6 or 7 years ago if I thought I'd be working on great hammerhead sharks for my PhD, I absolutely would be surprised I did a PhD in the first place, actually. My background has been in marine conservation and ecology, and I actually came from working on seafood mislabeling and recreational red snapper fishing as part of my master's. And you might think that's quite different than working on sharks, and you'd absolutely be correct. It was quite different. But when I fell in love with fieldwork during my master's and then started looking into PhD programs because I knew that it was something that I really wanted to continue, specifically around the fieldwork. And I met my advisor weirdly, I was in the field in the Galapagos and he happened to be there at the same time. And we met and we were talking about projects, and I knew I wanted to work on predator-prey dynamics. That was something that I had already decided was really an area of interest for me. And then serendipitously, he had funding for a project to look at the movement and behavior of great hammerhead sharks. So it really was just right place, right time. And I applied for a lot of different programs and interviewed a lot of different places. And then it all came back to working on great hammerheads. And of course, twist my arm, you couldn't ask for a more incredible species to work with. The thing that's super interesting about great hammerheads is that even though they are truly one of the most recognizable animals in the ocean, I mean, you can speak to any kindergartner and they will tell you that not only what a great hammerhead shark is, but it's probably their favorite shark. Even though they're so well known, there actually is a lot that we don't know about their basic biology and ecology because they're really difficult to study. For a lot of marine species, we can do studies in a lab or in an aquarium or observing them, for example, like on scuba or things like that. But great hammerheads are really big. They swim long distances, and they're actually quite sensitive. So they're hard to keep in an aquarium setting. So there's a lot of gaps that we need to fill with understanding this basic biology of great hammerheads. So one of the really interesting things about working with this species is that you have to come up with creative ways to learn about them in their own environment out in the ocean, right? And one of the ways that we can do that is using a technology called a biologger. And a biologger is essentially a data collecting device that you put on an animal. And you can put them on sharks. They design them for even small birds. You can have them on whales. I mean, there's all sorts of different designs of these biologgers to look at the behavior of these animals in their natural environment. So we do have the technology to put different sensors on great hammerhead sharks, let them swim around for a couple of days and collect all this data. And then we go back and retrieve the biologger and get to download all this really interesting information about the sharks. So my work in particular was looking at super fine scale movements of these sharks. I was specifically interested in their speed and acceleration, but the sensors collect all sorts of data around depth, temperature, acceleration on actually these 3 axes. So you can do really cool things like building 3D models of their movement. And all of that is on this one biologging sensor. And then we had a couple other sensors that we used, like a video sensor. It's just a little video camera that you put on the shark, and all of it fits together in a small package that then clamps on the dorsal fin or the back fin of the shark. So it was a pretty challenging project because a lot of things have to go right in order to get this data. First, you have to catch a hammerhead shark, and great hammerheads are a critically endangered species. They're not just super easy to find. And then you have to deploy the biologger on the animal, which you have to make sure that animal is healthy and ready to rock. And you put the biologger out, and then the way these biologgers are designed, they stay on the animal for a day or two, and then they pop off and float to the surface. So that means that we have to go out and actually recover that tag. And, it's, think of needle in a haystack. It's a tiny sensor in the middle of the ocean. And thankfully, we have tools like a satellite tag that tells us generally where it is. But I think that was the most challenging part of the whole work, is actually getting the data in the first place. And that's not unique to this project. I mean, field work is super challenging. It can be unpredictable, especially when you're working with big animals. So I wouldn't have changed a thing about my project, but I definitely didn't understand going into it just how difficult it would be to get each and every one of those data sets.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I have lots of follow-up questions. First, real quick, I'm curious, you mentioned that they're big animals and that you were specifically looking at like their speed, for example. How big, what's their general size range? And then how fast do they typically move through the ocean?
Yeah, so that's a good one. So, great hammerheads can get up to 15 feet or more, but the animals that we were tagging were mostly between 2 to 3 meters. So 2.5 to 3 meters. So all of them that we tagged were adults. They were past the size of sexual maturity. And the tagging in South Florida is really interesting because we are immediately next to the Gulf Stream. And so the sharks like to be in the Gulf Stream because that's where the prey is. And so the hammerheads come quite close to the coast here. So it's a relatively more convenient place to try and tag them. And let's see, their general cruising speed, I actually can't tell you because we're just about to publish it. You get all of this data from these biologging sensors, and some of them are super interesting in their own right, like cruising speed, right? That's really interesting to think about how fast are these animals generally moving through the water, especially for an animal like a great hammerhead that has to continually keep swimming in order to breathe. But the coolest part, in my opinion, is how we can combine all of these different sensors with different sort of analyses to answer bigger questions. So one thing, for example, is I can take the speed of the shark and the size of the animal that we tagged, and then run it through a whole bunch of formulas and actually calculate how many calories that shark probably has to eat in a day. And this is building off some really interesting work that was done previously that had a little model hammerhead in a wind tunnel that they calculated all of these formulas for how to get like lift and drag and all these other like hydrodynamic factors that are operating on the animal as they swim. And I won't take you down the path of all of the back end math, but essentially we have a series of formulas that you can take the data that we get from the field, run it through all of this math, and then say, on average, this shark would probably have to eat about this many calories per day. And it's actually probably less than you think. It's one of my favorite things when I go speak to classrooms. I'm like, how many calories do you think a great hammerhead has to eat? And the kids are like, 10,000 calories or 20,000 calories. But actually, there's many animals that we tag that actually have to eat about how much we eat or less in a day. And that's because we are warm-blooded and we spend so much energy keeping our bodies at the same temperature. But great hammerheads don't have that problem. Their body temperature generally matches the surrounding water temperature. So they just don't have to eat that much more like we do to keep our bodies at the same temperature.
You also mentioned that you really love the fieldwork aspect of it. So I wanted to ask what a typical day in the field might look like, and then how that kind of balances between analyzing data or writing papers and how much like relative time you would spend on each.
Yeah, this is a really good question. And it's one that comes up a lot, especially when I speak to people that are interested in going into the field of marine conservation. And the first thing that I always want to qualify is that you don't have to do field work, and you don't even have to be a scientist to work in the field of marine conservation. That's actually, I think, a common misconception that, I picked a more traditional path of going to my master's and my PhD and doing field-based research and things like that, especially with a big charismatic animal like a great hammerhead shark. But fieldwork can be pretty grueling. For example, sometimes you're out there in lousy weather, not unsafe, right? If the weather's unsafe, we don't go out. But I've had my fair share of having to take Dramamine and getting, it's hot, especially when you work down here. You go out on the boat and you're out on the boat all day long. And when we're fishing for sharks mostly. So we have these big weighted pieces of fishing equipment that we use. So you're hauling big weights and pulling big lines because you have to check the lines really frequently. And so there's a lot of physical stamina that comes into play. And there's also a lot of responsibility when you're in the field to take care of yourself. So that means the basics, like wearing sun protection, keeping your sunscreen. I mean, there's not 1 inch of me that's typically uncovered. Long sleeves, long pants, gloves, hat, everything buff. And I think there is sometimes this thought that being out on the boat all day is like being out on a nice, relaxing boat day that you might do with your friends. And it's a job. It's not at all what it's like. I think the other thing that people sometimes don't realize about fieldwork is that there could be a ton of downtime, especially if you're working on some sort of experiment, or for us, if you were shark fishing, you put these lines in the water and you can just sit around for an hour while you're waiting to check the lines. The sort of work I do now, since I finished my PhD, I still have a little bit of field work, but it's quite different. I'm on much bigger boats for longer chunks of time as opposed to the frequent day trips that I was doing during my PhD. And I think that that's something that when I was looking for a job, I actually wanted to tone down some of the field work after my PhD because I felt like I had such an amazing experience. But when I was thinking about my long-term job, it wasn't necessarily what I was looking for at this stage. But even at the peak of doing field work for my PhD, it really only takes up a certain proportion of your time. There's this big push to get data, but it's the tip of the iceberg. And most of the iceberg is preparing gear in the lab, fixing gear, reading papers, writing grant proposals. The other thing about this work, a lot of field work is really expensive. It doesn't have to be, but think about especially if you're going out on the boat, you have to pay for boat time. You have to pay, if you're traveling to a place, you have to find funds to cover your travel expenses. The equipment we were using was incredibly expensive. Those biologgers are expensive. And so a lot of that comes down to forming partnerships with groups like Georgia Aquarium funded all of our biologging tags. And then we have a partnership with them about how they can use the data. But you do spend quite a bit of your time writing grants and convincing people to fund your work. And I think that I feel fortunate because I've always really enjoyed writing. But I think that sometimes there's a risk that if you come into it just for the field work and being out on the water, then you're going to be miserable when it comes time to having to take all that data and turn it into like a peer-reviewed journal article. And that's another one that right now I'm truly in the thick of it. We have some we're trying to publish this work and we've gone through revisions with journals and resubmitting it. And I think that, publishing this work, especially we're working on critically endangered species, it is really not just important to furthering the scientific knowledge of these animals, but it's also, I think, ethically really important because for my PhD, I went out and I put these tags on living animals. I was asking something of them, right, to swim around and collect data. And especially because they're critically endangered, then it is my ethical responsibility as a scientist to make sure that that data goes to use for the general public and for the scientific community. So a short answer following a long answer is the fieldwork takes up just such a small fraction of the overall part of even being a field scientist. The fieldwork is just this much, and there's so much prep work and so much work after you're actually in the field.
Awesome. Thanks for that answer and also bringing up the ethical side of it. Sometimes we kind of shy away from that part of the conversation because it's a little harder to approach, but I like your perspective on it being that you did this research and there's a responsibility to then make use of it for the purpose of the animals. I also wanted to talk a little bit about a program that you were involved in that was related to this research, where you helped give students the opportunity to experience shark tagging. Can you talk a little bit about that and why that could be impactful on younger students?
Any sort of fieldwork involving sharks requires a really pretty decent sized team. Because if you think about it, you have to have a couple of people on the boat to actually help with the handling of the sharks. You need someone driving the boat. There's a lot of things that actually go into being able to do that fieldwork. And part of being able to collect this data is forming partnerships with groups that help fund and also help with the fieldwork aspect of collecting that data. It's important to find other people that have similar goals and see how you can work together and share resources. And as part of my PhD research, and then this program has continued on in the following years, is Florida International University's Shark Labs have a partnership with the Anjari Foundation, which is based out of West Palm, just up the road from us. And they have a vessel that they use for research, not just for shark research, but for multiple different types of research projects. And scientists can come and have partnerships with Anjari where they take you out to your field sites and things like that. But they also started this very specific program called Coastal Ocean Explorers. And it's designed to take students that are in the area, in the county, bring them on these fieldwork expeditions, but that those expeditions are actually contributing to real science. So for 1 year, I was the representative essentially from FIU working with the students, and we would go out to do shark tagging, but then also try to deploy my biologging tags. And the other thing that's also really important to talk about is that when we're out collecting data for my tags, you never know what shark you're going to pull up. And if we pulled up a great hammerhead, then we deploy the biologging tags. But if we pulled up another animal, we were actually able to collect data for other research projects that are going on throughout the university. So some people, for example, were interested in the size of the anal fins for the sharks to see if they could develop a program to help identify illegally trafficked fins. Other people were interested in collecting fin clips from animals to look at stable isotope analysis, which helps us see what the sharks were eating. So this partnership with Anjari not only was field time for me, it also allowed students to be involved with collecting data for all sorts of additional shark research projects. And the way it's designed is that there's a PhD student that is the partner for FIU every year. So the project that they're working on changes every year. My year, it was great hammerhead sharks. And then the next year, it was something totally different. The thing that's so interesting about this is that you see such a wide range of students. You know, some students come on board and they've been fishing before. Maybe they go out on the weekends on their boat or things like that, and they feel really comfortable on board. And then sometimes they're like, what do you mean I can't pull up the shark myself? Because we're working with middle schoolers. There's a lot that they are not allowed to do for safety reasons and things like that. So, but then sometimes you have people that get on board and this is their first time being on a boat. Maybe it's their first time being like around ocean animals like this. And it can be a really exciting experience. For some, it can be a little overwhelming. And I think that it is across the board a really unique opportunity for students to see what fieldwork is like and hear from scientists that are going through this process in real time. And we spend a lot of time talking about specifically the sharks and ecosystems that you will find in this South Florida area. So we're talking about their backyard. We're answering questions that people have about being scared about sharks or being worried about going into the ocean. And if there's any risk of shark bites and things like that, we field those questions. And I think that the key takeaway too is that the students get to see people at all stages of their career. Like we've got folks that have just started their PhD and they're in their early 20s. We've got folks that are later, like get to talk about what it's like going through college and the decisions that they made and why they did or didn't choose to go on to do this type of work. It's just, the questions are not just around the biology of the sharks, right? It's also about what does the career path look like to do a job like this? And we've got students come in, for example, that would be like, I know this is cool. I know that I don't want to do this, but what if I wanted to still help the ocean, right? And we get to talk about all the other ways you could maybe get work for an environmental nonprofit or go into the government or pretty much apply any skill that you have, whether it's if you're an artist, if you're interested in math and finance, and if you're interested in writing, that there's all sorts of ways you can apply those skills to ocean conservation. So it's a really fantastic partnership because it not only exposes kids that are local to the area to this fieldwork and see why it's important to their own backyard, but that it also allows them to think about this field and whether or not it's something that they would be interested in. And it contributes to science. We're actually collecting real data.
That is really awesome. And it's great that there's so many different things that students can take from that experience, depending on what they're interested in or what they can imagine themselves doing in the future, or just questions that they have that maybe they didn't have somebody to ask about that before.
Yeah, it's a really unique experience. I mean, I never had anything like that when I was in middle school and high school. And it's really interesting to see how some of the students respond. And for some students, it's like, I didn't even know this was a possibility. And they come off really excited, right? I didn't know this field even existed and that you could do this for a job. So that's always fun to talk about that as well.
For the last part of kind of our shark section of the episode, I would like to talk about National Geographic. You have worked with them on some programs, specifically Shark Fest programs, talking about your research with sharks and the different tools that you use and things like that. Can you tell us a little bit about that whole experience and how it kind of contrasts with communicating science through writing, which is what we'll be talking about next?
Yeah, absolutely. National Geographic was a very important partner for us when it comes to getting out and funding some of the field work and getting a lot of boat time. And I was really fortunate to be able to work with a couple of different NatGeo crews for different programs, but it was all still supporting the same research. And I really want to give a shout out to my advisor, Yanni Papastamatu. He's done a lot of Shark Week and Shark Fest programs before. And sometimes the producers would reach out to him because he was the person that they knew, and he could have easily just done those programs himself, right? That would have totally been fine. But he always went out of his way to say, like, this is my student's project. Talk to her. She should be involved. And I feel really grateful because that gave me the opportunity to participate in something that I never in a million years imagined, which is being on National Geographic Shark Fest, talking about my own research. And so I'm really grateful to him for that. And I learned so much doing those programs because all of them were literally just doing what I would normally do in the field, which is trying to get these biologging tags out. But one of the things that we have talked about is that fieldwork can be really, really unpredictable. And sometimes we'd be out on the water and the conditions were rough or we weren't catching anything. And then there's all these other factors. And then there's also sometimes like emotion that comes into, say, if the tag didn't work and you weren't able to catch any sharks that day, or if you've had to cancel fieldwork, like there's emotion that comes along with that. And I show my emotion on my sleeve. So all of a sudden the idea of like experiencing joy or heartbreak or frustration or anything in the field is like magnified because there's a camera there. And I can't hide my emotions to save my life. So I think that what the result of it was actually like quite authentic of what we experience in the field. And thankfully we were able to get some really good data out of working with those programs. And I'm just about hopefully, well, actually, no, one of them has been accepted. We're just about to share some great work that came out of a partnership with a number of partners, including National Geographic. So it was really fun to participate in those, but it also, when I'm used to writing my own stuff, I get to edit it all the time. I get to go back and revisit it. There is this feeling of a little bit of fear of loss of control of like, they're there and they're filming and then you don't know what it's going to look like until it actually airs. So it took me years to watch one of them after it came out. I was like, I'm too nervous. So I feel really grateful for the opportunity to have done that. And thankfully, all of them, we worked with amazing film crews that really, really wanted to get the science right. It was very important to them to get the science right, which I really appreciate. And that was that was incredibly important to us too, of making sure that what is being represented is true to the work that we were doing.
That is something that we've touched on a few times on Shellphone, of the way that science is portrayed in media, whether that's like nonfiction media or fiction. So there's a lot of work that goes into it. Yeah, thanks for sharing about that.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because I come from a science and communications background. So I feel like I have learned in these two different ways and have empathy for each side of like, I've had the conversation with someone that's like, the general public is not going to understand this the way it's written, and we need to change that wording or present it in a different way. And then I've also then been on the other side of this fear of like, there's a lot of qualifiers that go into the work of like how you can and can't apply the findings and things like that. And there's, the worst thing is this idea of the science being misrepresented, and especially in a time where some people are skeptical about science. And so getting the science right and getting how that science is applied within like a general public kind of communication space is so important. So I have empathy all around. I should say I have empathy all around, and I have anxiety on both sides, right? I know the struggle for trying to communicate the science to the absolute best of its ability.
So that kind of gives us a really good transition into our next topic, which is the 2 children's books that you have written, which you also wrote while you were doing your PhD, which I'd love to talk about that side of it. But the 2 books are The World of Coral Reefs, which was published in 2022, and then The Incredible Octopus, which was published in 2024. And they both educate kids and me on fascinating parts of our oceans, the threats that they're facing sometimes, and how we can help them. Yeah, can you introduce us to those?
Absolutely. So I've always really enjoyed writing about the ocean for a public audience, right? Before I went back to graduate school and wanted to pursue this career in science, I worked for Ocean Conservancy, which is an ocean nonprofit. And part of my job was to write for the blog. And it was the coolest thing because I just got to say, what am I curious about? I got to research it and then just write it up. And that can be anything from like, how toxic is the stonefish to, what are animals that live in the Antarctic? I mean, I just got to explore all these different questions and then present them in a way that hopefully people really learned something and then also enjoyed. It was interesting because the book actually, the opportunity came to me because the publisher actually reached out to me on my website after reading some of these pieces that I did for Ocean Conservancy. And it's this incredible publisher. Their name is Story, and they had done some really wonderful nonfiction children's books. But previously they had done it where they had a writer that worked with a scientist to kind of fact check and work together. And they said that moving forward, they wanted to try a new model where you got one person that was both a scientist and a writer. So they invited me to essentially apply for this book pitch. And I wrote a pitch and I wrote an outline and draft pages and I sent it in and they liked it. So that's how The World of Coral Reefs was born. And I absolutely loved writing this book because it was a lot more challenging than I even realized it would be, because there were so many things that I had to think about of like, you're writing for an audience of late elementary, maybe early middle school. What are the most important things that you want to get across about coral reefs to that age group? And also, how do you strike that balance of like not dumbing things down too much, but also presenting science in a way that's really fun and interesting? The niche that this book was supposed to fill, and I like to think that it did fill this niche, is like for that particular age group, there's a lot of really wonderful narrative fiction. There's a lot of, really good kind of textbook style stuff, but not something that is a nonfiction, fewer things that are like a nonfiction book that can also be read like a story, if that makes sense. So that was something that we try to do with this book. And that all of the science in the book comes from peer-reviewed sources. And that was something that was really important to me. And, there's lots of challenges. When I was writing, for example, about coral reproduction, I was like, how do you describe the difference between sexual and asexual reproduction of a coral to like a fifth grader. And I think one of the things I learned through the book was that all the children that I worked with, like tested with my friends' kids and like classrooms where we read things and what do you think? And is this interesting and whatever. That age group has just such an incredible ability to absorb information and can handle a lot more information than I even realized. Like, for example, we're covering the sort of topics that you would cover in an intro biology class in college, right? We're talking about like mutualistic relationships and zooxanthellae that live in the corals. And I was just so excited to see how it came together and really proud of the work. And then I loved it so much that I immediately turned around and submitted a pitch for The Incredible Octopus, which thankfully my publisher was like, run with it, go for it. And octopuses are my all-time favorite animals. And so that was just incredible to write that as well. And it was a bigger book. It was a lot more research and I got to build it completely from scratch. So that was something I was really proud of as well.
Awesome. There's one change between the two books that I kind of wanted to mention and see if there was any specific reasoning behind or how that changed the process of writing the book or like who it was aimed towards or the overall impact of the book. And that's that The World of Coral Reefs was illustrated, where The Incredible Octopus featured photographs instead of illustrations. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Totally. And I have them here and I'll show as a visual like the difference. So this is The World of Coral Reefs. And we worked with this incredible illustrator, Alexandria Neonakis, that just like, I mean, the illustrations are just spectacular. And part of this book, as it was designed to kind of feel like a storybook, but it's nonfiction science. I think that the illustrations really went a long way in helping it feel like a storybook. And the interesting thing about that is I got to work really closely with Alexandria, where I wrote all the copy and then she would do these like rough outline sketches of what it would look like. And then we got to go back and forth in this iterative process and then to also make sure it was scientifically accurate. And I'm sure, I don't mean to put words in her mouth. She never said anything like this, but if I were her, I'm sure I was a pain sometimes because it'd be like, actually, this coral polyp should have 6 tentacles, like those sorts of things. But it means that there's scientific accuracy all through, and everyone on the team and the publisher and the illustrator, we were all super adamant about making sure that the science was right. Now, looking to The Incredible Octopus, this book is longer. It's almost, I think it's more than double the size of The World of Coral Reefs. And it is not designed to be for you to sit down and read it in one sitting. It's broken into 4 parts of all these different, it's like biology of octopuses. And there's one that's all about like the different, I call it octopus superlative. So it's like the deepest and the smallest and all sorts of things like that. So it's designed that you can actually sit down and either look up something that you want to learn or read it in chunks. So in that way, it's not as important for it to feel like a storybook. And I think there's a lot of really cool science that I feature in The Incredible Octopus that actually having photos of it is amazing. But we also were able to use, like here, for example, this is one of my favorite spreads. This is the mimic octopus. So this is in the superlative section and it's best disguised. And you actually get to see what it looks like in real life. And, octopuses are already so far out of this world, right? They're so wild that I think in the case of the octopuses, having the photos almost makes it even wilder because there's no exaggeration. They're really that wild looking in real life. And the other thing I'm really proud of with that book is I really wanted to feature people doing different types of research with octopuses. And I knew one of the folks that was featured, Megan Cook, who works on the EV Nautilus, which is this and with Ocean Exploration Trust, which is this incredible deep sea exploration vessel. And they do some really awesome outreach and education work. And I got to interview her about the time where they were on the EV Nautilus and they found this like deep sea octopus garden, as they called it, which is just full of all of these octopuses. But then I got to essentially just cold email other researchers that I found online and made some incredible connections and interviews that way. So the process of writing the book was truly so much fun because I just got to learn. I'm a nerd, right? I'm an ocean nerd too. So I just got to learn all this cool stuff about octopuses and then write that for other people to get excited about octopuses. So it truly was such a special opportunity that I'm really grateful for.
I'm curious if you have any like favorite facts about the octopus or a favorite type of octopus, anything that you want to share like that.
I typically have this stuffed animal really close to here, but I don't know where it is right now. But my all-time favorite octopus is the blue-ringed octopus. And my favorite fact about them is that they're only the size of a golf ball, but they're uber venomous, and they have like enough toxins to kill 26 or so people, I think is the stat. That one's in the book too. And they've got such stunning colors. They have these blue rings that they can flash to warn predators or anyone that messes with them to stay away. So here we go. Look at how cool those guys are. So there you go. That's my favorite.
That's a good one. I work at a discovery center, and sometimes when we have extra time on our hands, we look up like a specific animal
that's cool.
that comes up in conversation somehow. One time we were looking up that octopus, and like every other sentence that we read, we were like amazed by like how small it was or how deadly it was or how
They're
cool
so
it
metal.
looked.
They're so cool. Do you have another fun fact that you have looked up that you remember from the Discovery Center?
Well, one that we spent a lot of time looking into is lionfish, because we have some lionfish, and we always are like telling people about how they're venomous, and they have the spines on their backs that are the venomous parts, but we couldn't quite remember like how many spines were venomous because some of them aren't. So we looked that up, and then I went on a dive into some research papers and ended up finding like a diagram of like how those spines actually look and work. Gosh. And they're like serrated, so they just scrape across your skin, and then that's how the venom goes. Yeah. Things like that.
And it's got like a groove. It's got like a sheath and a groove that like the venom. I mean, I think that venomous and poisonous animals are the coolest, and I love learning about them. And there's a lot of really cool examples of like all the ways that these gnarly ocean animals can kill you. And the answer is just leave them alone, right?
Yeah.
I actually wrote a piece for Ocean Conservancy years ago about the blue-ringed octopus. And one day out of nowhere, it got like all of these views. And we looked it up, and it's because someone had posted a TikTok holding one that they had like picked up. They're like, look at this. And I was like, oh my God, put that down. And people wrote, like news outlets wrote about it, which is why everyone was Googling like, how toxic is it? And the answer is really freaking toxic. Do not touch. But yeah, those are definitely my favorite.
So while you were writing these books at the same time you were doing your PhD, how did that work with the process of writing the books? And like, what did your life kind of look like at that point?
Now that I'm out of the PhD, I wouldn't have changed anything because these projects were really important to me. And also, I finished my PhD in 5 years, which was what the plan was. And it was also really important for me to keep on that schedule of like trying to finish in 5 years. I started in 2019. So the effect of COVID on fieldwork was pretty tough. There were, I had deadlines for the books that were non-negotiable. And there was some time leading up to that was pretty tough. I mean, the World of Coral Reefs wasn't so bad because it aligned that my fieldwork was frozen because of COVID at the same time I was working on that book. So it was a really beautiful outlet for me during that time we were all in lockdown to like work on that book. But The Incredible Octopus, to be frank, I wrote that book proposal. I was so excited about it and I wasn't really honest with myself about what the consequences were of getting another book contract while in that stage of my PhD where like things are further along. So I did a lot of work at night. You finish the work during the day, you work at night. I didn't take a single plane ride or train ride that I didn't work on. Working on family vacations. I mean, it's not something that I would recommend. And it was something that is in my last year of my PhD, which was after the book came out, which was great. I was, but in my last year of my PhD, like I don't think I didn't work on that dissertation a single day for 6 months. I mean, it was pretty rough, but I was really motivated to see it through. And so it's been kind of a weird transition after the PhD where I don't have that right now. I'm in a job that I love, but that I work 9 to 5. And then sometimes I have field work, but that's only a couple weeks of the year. And so like after the book was done, after the PhD was done, I was like, what am I supposed to do at night and on the weekends? So it is not a work-life balance I would recommend, but I am proud that I made the time to work on this project, the book projects that were also really important to me personally, you know?
Yeah, it's fun to have something that you're so excited about that you're willing to spend the time on, even when you have so many other things going on at the same time.
Yeah. The hardest thing is like, there's this temptation of, for example, I would get to a real roadblock in part of my analysis of the PhD, which is very normal. And then there's this temptation to like stop working on that and start working on something else, like the book, which sometimes can actually be a nice little brain break. It's like better to get your brain active in something else than say like totally switch it off and watch like Real Housewives, right? Like it was still a really good exercise to be working on the book, but it took a lot of self-reflection and like discipline to be like, when you have to sit on an analysis problem and say like, you just got to sit here and figure it out. And it's not going to be fun, but, it took there were some definitely days that I didn't get it right, but in the end, everything was finished by their due date. So that's the thing that is important.
You've mentioned in general having kind of dual career interests in communications and in science. Did you picture at the beginning of that would manifest into children's books specifically, or?
No, I mean, there's a lot of things that really surprised me. When I was an undergrad, I really felt like I had to choose. Like I had to either do a biology major or like a communications major. And thankfully I had some really incredible mentors in undergrad that helped me talk through that and see a pathway for combining them. And I never thought I would do a PhD because, when I was in those intro bio classes, everyone seemed so certain that that's what they wanted to do. And I didn't feel that way. And so I never thought that going on to do a research-based PhD was in my future. And then I never dreamed that getting to write children's books would be in my future either. So I think the thing that I found most valuable is continuing to further my skills in both science and writing, even when I didn't know what that was going to turn into. Like I wrote a lot. I had like a personal website that I wrote a lot on, and then I wrote a lot for free. And then I started to get paid for some of that too. And I think building up that portfolio over time, and it took a long time, was important. Then when I was in my first job trying to like apply for grants to do the science and really thinking critically about how I can make time for both and keep those opportunities, keep those doors open. And then not being afraid to say no to opportunities when they come up, and then once I started thinking about the PhD, I never in a million years thought I would be working on great hammerheads. So on one hand, it can seem kind of all over the place. Like I worked on lionfish, and then I worked on red snapper and seafood, and then I worked on sharks. But then on the other hand, I hope that it is encouraging for other folks to be like, if you don't know like exactly the direction that you want to go, being open to opportunities and jumping into different things can take you on some really spectacular paths.
Yeah, sometimes it just comes down to going with the flow.
Yeah, exactly. Although I will say I am still envious. There's some people that I knew from school, for example, that like they're like, I'm going to finish my undergrad, I'm going to get a PhD, and then I'm going to do the faculty track. And they did it and they're loving it. And there's something really beautiful about that too, of like knowing exactly the direction that you want to go. But then, there's beautiful things on each side.
Very true. Since we're kind of getting towards the
Sorry,
end of
I've just been talking your ear off.
That is totally fine. I was just going to ask, we talked a little bit about your favorite octopus. So going to the other side, I was going to ask if you have any kind of favorite facts or points about corals and coral reefs.
Yeah, this is a good one. One of the things that I love about coral reefs is the statistic of like a quarter of the animals in the ocean rely on a healthy reef ecosystem. they call them the rainforests of the sea for a reason. But I think the coolest thing that I learned over the course of my career about corals is learning about cold water corals and deep sea corals. A lot of people think about coral reefs as the warm, tropical, sunlit reefs that you think about the Great Barrier Reef and things like that. And they are incredibly important. And they have these really beautiful, big reef building hard corals, and they're very colorful and things like that. But a lot of people aren't as familiar with the fact that corals can live in much colder waters and in the deep sea. There are deep sea corals. There's corals that live in the mesophotic zone, which is that kind of middle light zone where there's some sunlight that reaches through, but not enough for the algae that shallow water corals use. So there's some stunning videos that different research vessels have taken using an ROV or remotely operated vehicle. They send down to collect footage of the cold water corals. So that's definitely my favorite.
Awesome. One of my favorite things about corals is their relationship with zooxanthellae, partially because that's such a fun word to say.
Such a fun word.
This is another thing that we were talking about at the Discovery Center the other day was zooxanthellae. Could you tell us what that is and what relationship that has with corals? Just real quick.
Totally. Yeah. So zooxanthellae is the coolest word ever. And, people look at these colorful corals, but the coral itself isn't colorful. They get their colors from this symbiotic relationship that they have with the zooxanthellae. And so zooxanthellae is a type of algae that lives in the tissues of the coral, and they get from the coral protection, and then the zooxanthellae uses photosynthesis and the coral polyp gets food. And I think that's an important thing. I should step back. Corals, people look at them and they kind of look like rocks, right? But they're living animals, and a coral colony, if you think of a big coral head, it's a coral colony made up of many, many, many little coral polyps, which really just look like little anemones, which makes sense because they're related to anemones. They're in the same group. So these little coral polyps are in the coral colony, and then the zooxanthellae live in there, and they have this symbiotic relationship. But that's also why when you hear the phrase coral bleaching, the corals are white because they kick out the zooxanthellae when they get stressed out, and then the white calcium carbonate hard structure of the coral is left over. And they can recover from that, and they can take the zooxanthellae back in. But if they stay stressed out for too long, it can actually kill the coral. So we've been hearing more and more, especially with the warming conditions in the ocean, about these coral bleaching events. And that is also related to their relationship with zooxanthellae.
Great. So to kind of close out the episode, as the ocean continues to change with warming or other stressors that it faces, what gives you hope in conservation and marine science as a whole?
Yeah, I think about this a lot. And this is a question I get a lot from students that I talk to, because I think some people entering the field, it can seem kind of intimidating because the ocean has a lot of big problems that it's facing, right? And climate change is the biggest problem facing our ocean right now. But it's not the only one, right? We've got plastics, and we've got overfishing. There's a lot of things. And it can seem overwhelming to think about where you put your energy. How can you as one person really help? And I think that the thing that brings me the most hope is that it can seem overwhelming to think of how do I as one person help the ocean? How can I make a big difference? And what is most exciting for me and makes me the most hopeful is that when I see that I've picked this narrow little focus that I did my PhD research on, and this narrow little focus that now I'm doing my full-time job on. I've met so many people throughout the course of my career that have also picked their narrow little focus, and they're working on something else. And there's just this, sorry for this metaphor, but there's just a sea of people that have all found their little niche in working in ocean conservation, that all of us together are trying to move the needle with this healthier, more sustainable ocean. And I think that you simply can't do this job if you focus on the negative all the time. I think that's the case for any job where you're trying to make a big change. And so I find these incredible joys all along this process by meeting other people and reading the literature and celebrating wins as they come out. So it makes me really hopeful, also, especially to talk to young people that are really passionate about a healthy ocean as well. I mean, that's part of the hope of the children's books, of inspiring a next generation of ocean stewards and folks that are going to help us combat these big problems.
Awesome. So that's a great note to end on, being hopeful and hopefully inspiring others for the future. And thank you so much for joining us on Shellphone and talking with me today. I loved learning about these topics more and kind of your journey through the PhD program and different methods of communication. And I also learned a ton from reading your 2 books. Even though they are geared towards younger audiences, there's so much valuable information in there. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm always just so excited to connect with other folks and share a little bit about the work that I've done, and then also just learn more about what everyone else is doing. So thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. Thanks for tuning into Shellphone. To learn more about our projects, suggest a guest, or donate to the show, visit our website at breachthesurface.org or social media at breachthesurface and at Shellphone Podcast. You can also subscribe to our show on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. To learn more about Erin's work, you can find her website at erintspencer.com or visit her Instagram at erintspencer. Thanks for listening.